James Walker wiped sweat from his brow as he loaded the last crate of watermelons onto his roadside stand. The bank notice in his pocket felt heavier than the fruit he'd been hauling since dawn. 2 missed mortgage payments, and now they were threatening foreclosure on the farm that had been in his family for 3 generations. That's when he noticed the luxury SUV pulled over in the summer heat, windows down, children fanning themselves in the back seat. Without hesitation, he grabbed his best watermelons and walked over. "Please, take these," he insisted, refusing their money. "It's too hot for kids to go without something cool." 7 days later, that same SUV returned, but this time with a convoy of black sedans behind it. Men and women in tailored suits emerged, carrying leather portfolios with a familiar global logo. Could a simple act of kindness to strangers transform a failing farm into something extraordinary? And how far would a grateful family go to repay an unexpected gift? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The summer sun beat down mercilessly on Walker Farms, a modest 40-acre plot nestled in the rolling countryside of Georgia. The once thriving family operation had dwindled to a shadow of its former glory, with rows of crops giving way to fallow fields and equipment gathering rust beside the weathered barn. James Walker, 42, stood on his porch, squinting at the horizon where dark clouds promised rain that never seemed to come. His weathered hands clutched another foreclosure notice, the 3rd one this month. The paper trembled slightly in his calloused fingers, not from the gentle breeze that offered no relief from the sweltering heat, but from the anger and fear that coursed through his veins. 5 generations of Walkers had tended this soil since 1898, when his great-great-grandfather, William Walker, had purchased the original 100 acres with savings from his brow. Time as a railroad worker. Through world wars, the Great Depression, droughts, and floods, the Walkers had persevered, adapting to changing markets and technologies while maintaining the core values that defined them: hard work, integrity, and a deep connection to the land that sustained them. James traced his finger over the bank's letterhead, the corporate logo, an impersonal reminder of how times had changed. In his grandfather's day, a farmer's word was his bond, and a handshake with the local banker sealed agreements that helped both parties weather difficult seasons. Now, farming had become a numbers game, with faceless corporations making decisions based on spreadsheets rather than relationships. The human element, the generations of knowledge, the stewardship of the land, the commitment to quality meant nothing in the cold calculations of profit margins and return on investment. "Daddy, are we going to sell watermelons today?" His 10-year-old daughter, Lily, appeared beside him, her hopeful smile a painful contrast to the worry lines etched across his face. Her honey-brown hair was pulled back in 2 uneven braids. She'd learned to do them herself after Sarah passed. She had her mother's eyes, warm and expressive, with the same slight crinkle at the corners when she smiled. At times, looking at her was like seeing a ghost, a beautiful reminder of what he'd lost and what he still had to fight for. James forced a smile, tucking the notice into his back pocket. No need for her to shoulder adult worries, though he suspected she understood more than she let on. Children on farms grew up fast, learning early about the harsh realities of life and death, success and failure. Still, he tried to shield her from the worst of their financial troubles. She'd already lost her mother. He didn't want her to lose her childhood, too. "You bet we are, sweetheart. And today's going to be different. I can feel it." It was a lie he'd been telling himself for months. Each morning, he'd load his pickup truck with the best of his watermelon crop, the only thing that had survived the drought, and set up a stand by the highway. Some days he'd make enough to put gas in the truck and food on the table. Most days, he'd return with most of his produce and a heavier heart. Lily studied his face, and for a moment, James thought she might call him on the optimistic fiction. Instead, she nodded solemnly, accepting the unspoken pact between them. He would pretend things were looking up, and she would pretend to believe him. It was their dance, the careful choreography of a father and daughter trying to protect each other from painful truths. "I made ham sandwiches for lunch," she said, changing the subject. And I put extra pickles in yours." James felt a surge of love and pride so intense it nearly brought tears to his eyes. His daughter, making lunch for them both while he'd been out checking irrigation lines at dawn, taking on responsibilities no child should have to bear, yet doing so with a grace that humbled him. "Extra pickles? Well now, that sounds like the best sandwich in Georgia." He ruffled her hair, marveling at how she could still be so caring, so considerate, despite everything they'd been through. Sarah would be proud of the young woman Lily was becoming, even as James mourned the circumstances forcing her to grow up too quickly. The Walker family farm had once been the pride of Sumner County. James' grandfather had established it in 1946 after returning from World War II, turning hard work and determination into 200 acres of prosperous farmland. Harold Walker had arrived home from the Pacific with nightmares that would plague him for decades, but also with a vision for the future, a place where he could raise a family in peace, working with the rhythms of nature rather than the Maya chaos of war. Harold had used his military savings to buy the land, then a neglected cotton farm worn out by generations of single-crop cultivation. Neighbors had thought him foolish for investing in depleted soil, but Harold had a plan. He'd studied agricultural science before the war and understood the principles of crop rotation and soil management that were just beginning to gain acceptance in farming communities. What really set Harold apart, though, was his obsession with watermelons. While other local farmers focused on traditional cash crops like cotton, peanuts, and tobacco, Harold dedicated a portion of his land to experimenting with different watermelon varieties. He crossed Charleston Grays with black diamonds, Congo with crimson sweets, carefully selecting for traits that combined sweetness, texture, and hardiness. "A watermelon isn't just food," he would tell James when he was a boy, guiding his small hands through the delicate process of hand pollination. "It's joy in fruit form. You watch a person bite into a perfect watermelon, and for a moment, all their troubles melt away. That's not just growing food, that's growing happiness." By the early 1960s, Harold had developed what would become the farm's legacy, the Walker Sweet Watermelon, a distinctive variety with an ideal balance of sugar and acidity, crisp texture, and a deep ruby flesh that remained firm even when perfectly ripe. Local restaurants and grocers clamored for Walker Sweets, willing to pay premium prices for what quickly became known as the best watermelons in 3 counties. James' father, Robert Walker, had built on that foundation, expanding their watermelon acreage and establishing a small processing facility where they produced watermelon preserves and pickled rinds that sold in Bay specialty shops across the Southeast. Under Robert's management, Walker Farms had reached its peak, employing 15 full-time workers and becoming one of the area's most stable agricultural operations. Those prosperous years had shaped James's childhood summers, spent learning every aspect of the farm operation, from planting to harvest to marketing. He'd absorbed his grandfather's passion for the perfect watermelon and his father's head for business, assuming that someday he would take his place in the proud lineage of Walker farmers, passing the knowledge and land to his own children. Life, however, had other plans. The consolidation of the agricultural industry in the 1990s and early 2000s had squeezed small farmers like the Walkers. Massive agribusiness corporations drove prices down, making it increasingly difficult for family operations to compete. Climate change brought unpredictable weather patterns, longer droughts punctuated by devastating floods. Then came the personal tragedies. Robert Walker suffered a fatal heart attack in 2015, leaving James to take over operations with minimal transition planning. 2 years later, Sarah was diagnosed with an aggressive form of breast cancer. The medical bills mounted as they sought every possible treatment, draining their savings and forcing James to take out a second mortgage on the farm. Despite their best efforts, Sarah passed away 18 months after her diagnosis, leaving James emotionally devastated and financially ruined. Now, all that remained was the core 40 acres, the weathered farmhouse, and a mountain of debt that grew with each passing month. The processing facility had been shut down years ago, the equipment sold to cover medical expenses. Most of the farmland had been sold off piece by piece, leaving just enough to maintain a modest watermelon crop, the last vestige of the Walker legacy. "Let's get moving," James said, ruffling Lily's hair. "You're my good luck charm today." They loaded the truck with crates of watermelons, each one personally tended by James from seed to harvest. Walker sweet watermelons, or just any variety, they were the result of generations of careful cultivation, a hybrid his grandfather had developed that produced fruit with a distinctive sweetness and just the right amount of crispness. The deep green rind with lighter green stripes concealed a vibrant red interior that was almost impossibly juicy. James often found himself thinking about his grandfather's words as he tended the vines. "A watermelon isn't just food, Jimmy," the old man would say, his leathery hands caressing the growing fruit. "It's a promise. You promise the plant good soil and water, and it promises you sweetness in return. Never break your end of the bargain." He'd kept that promise through the hardest of times, even when financial advisors suggested switching to more profitable crops or selling out to developers who were buying up farmland all around the county. The Walker sweet watermelon was more than a crop, it was his heritage, a living connection to generations past. James still maintained the seed bank his grandfather had established, hundreds of carefully labeled glass jars containing seeds from each year's best specimens. He followed the same meticulous selection process, choosing only the fruits that displayed the perfect combination of sweetness, texture, and appearance. Each winter, he would spread the seeds on the kitchen table, studying them under a magnifying glass, selecting only the most perfect specimens for the next season's planting. It was a labor of love that made little economic sense in an era of commercial hybrid seeds and genetically modified crops. James could have made more money growing whatever the market demanded, using modern agricultural techniques that maximized yield at the expense of flavor. But every time he considered abandoning the Walker sweet, he would remember the look on people's faces when they tasted one for the first time, that moment of surprise, followed by pure joy. The simple pleasure of experiencing something authentically delicious in a world increasingly dominated by artificial flavors and mass production. By 9 in the morning, they had set up their humble stand along Highway 82, their faded Walker watermelons banner flapping weakly in the hot breeze. Cars whizzed by, few bothering to slow down. The digital thermometer on a nearby bank sign flashed 94 degrees, and it wasn't even noon yet. "Remember, Lily," James instructed, as they arranged the melons in an appealing display, "we're asking $15 for the large ones, $10 for the medium." Lily nodded seriously, adjusting her straw hat. "And samples. We need to give samples." James smiled at his daughter's business acumen. "That's right. Can't sell 'em if they don't know how good they taste." He watched as she carefully arranged small cups of pre-cut watermelon chunks on a tray. Despite everything they'd been through, Lily maintained an optimism that both inspired and worried him. She shouldn't have to worry about sales strategies at her age. She should be enjoying summer vacation, playing with friends, being a child. But life had forced responsibilities on her too early, just as it had for him when his own mother died young. A few locals stopped by throughout the morning. Mrs. Jenkins, who taught 3rd grade at the Sowell Elementary School, buying a small melon and chatting about the summer reading program. Pete Garrison from the auto shop, grabbing 2 large ones for a family barbecue. The Rodriguez family, who ran the Mexican restaurant in town and always bought several for their special weekend agua fresca. These regulars were the backbone of their business. Loyal customers who appreciated the quality of Walker watermelons and made a point of supporting local farmers. But their purchases, while welcome, weren't enough to keep the farm afloat. James needed more volume, more consistent sales. Ideally a wholesale account with a grocery chain or restaurant group. He'd been trying to secure such arrangements for years. But the realities of small-scale production made it difficult to compete with large commercial growers who could guarantee consistent supply at lower prices. By noon, they had sold exactly 3 watermelons. James checked his wallet. $40 wouldn't make a dent in the $4.300 he needed for the mortgage payment due next week, let alone the FERT. $156,000 total debt looming over him. The bank manager, Harold Phillips, had been clear during their last meeting. "I've extended every courtesy I can, James, but business is business. If you can't make the next payment, We'll have to begin foreclosure proceedings." The memory of that conversation burned in his stomach. Phillips had known James's father, had even hunted on their land. But personal connections meant little against the cold logic of balance sheets and profit margins. As the afternoon wore on, Lily retreated to the shade of a nearby oak tree with her book, while James stood stoically by the stand, occasionally calling out to passing cars. The rejection was becoming routine. The slight shake of a driver's head, the avoided eye contact, the occasional sympathetic wave from locals who knew his situation but couldn't afford to help. He tried not to dwell on what would happen if they lost the farm. His brother Rob had offered them a place to stay in Ohio, maybe a job at his construction company. The thought of working for his younger brother, of abandoning the land his grandfather had built, felt like a physical pain in his chest. But pride wouldn't put food on the table or keep a roof over Lily's head. Sometimes, in his darkest moments, James wondered if his grandfather's beloved watermelons had been worth the sacrifice. If Harold had focused on reliable cash crops instead of pursuing his passion for the perfect watermelon, would the farm be on sounder financial footing today? Was James clinging to a legacy that ultimately had doomed them all? But then he would slice open one of his melons, the knife cutting through the rind with that distinctive cracking sound, revealing the perfect crimson flesh inside, and he would know. This wasn't just about farming or making money. This was about preserving something genuine in a world increasingly dominated by fakery and mass production. Walker's sweet watermelons were real, the result of decades of careful cultivation, of thousands of hours spent tending vines, observing subtle differences in flavor and texture, selecting for qualities that couldn't be measured by machines or replicated in laboratories. At 3 o'clock, a gleaming black SUV with tinted windows pulled onto the gravel shoulder about 50 yards from the stand. James straightened his posture, hope flickering briefly. The vehicle sat idling for a few minutes, then a window rolled down, revealing a distressed-looking woman fanning herself. The air conditioning had apparently failed, and in the back seat, 2 children, a boy around 12 and a girl maybe 8, pressed their faces against the windows, clearly uncomfortable in the heat. Without thinking, James selected 3 of his best watermelons and carried them toward the vehicle. As he approached, he could hear the woman on the phone. "Yes, Richard, we're stuck here until the service vehicle arrives. No, I don't know how long it will take. It's nearly 100 degrees, and the kids are melting." She looked up with surprise as James approached, quickly ending her call. "Excuse me, ma'am," James said, offering his most reassuring smile. "I couldn't help but notice you folks are having some trouble. Thought you might appreciate something cool while you wait." The woman rolled her window down further. She was elegantly dressed despite the heat, with a silk blouse and what looked like expensive jewelry. Her dark hair was pulled back in a perfect chignon, not a strand out of place despite the sweltering temperature. Everything about her screamed money and sophistication, making James acutely aware of his sweat-stained t-shirt and worn jeans. "That's very kind, but we're fine. How much do we owe you?" Her voice carried the polished cadence of someone accustomed to being in charge. James shook his head. "Nothing at all. Please, take them. It's too hot for kids to go without something cool." The woman's perfectly manicured eyebrows rose in surprise. "Are you sure? We're happy to pay." "Absolutely sure," James replied, handing the first watermelon through the window. "I'm James Walker. These are from our family farm just down the road. Walker's sweet watermelons been growing them for 3 generations." The woman accepted the fruit with genuine gratitude. "I'm Catherine Reynolds. These are my children, Alex and Emma." The kids had perked up at the prospect of watermelon and were now leaning forward eagerly. "Nice to meet you all. Let me show you the best way to check if these are ripe." James demonstrated his grandfather's technique, thumping the melon with his knuckles. "Hear that hollow sound? That's how you know it's perfect." He handed the remaining watermelons through the window, then produced a pocket knife. "Would you like me to cut one open for you?" Catherine hesitated only briefly before nodding. James skillfully sliced one melon on his tailgate, then presented chunks on a paper plate he retrieved from his truck. The children's eyes widened as they tasted the fruit. "Mom, this is amazing!" Alex exclaimed. It's way better than the watermelon we get at home. Emma nodded enthusiastically, juice dripping down her chin. It tastes like candy. Catherine took a piece herself, and James couldn't help feeling a flash of pride at her expression of surprise. This is remarkable. I've never tasted watermelon like this. The genuineness of their reaction was something James had seen countless times that moment of discovery, when someone tasted a Walker Sweet for the first time. It wasn't just polite appreciation. It was the recognition that they were experiencing something extraordinary. In that moment, all the hours of labor, all the financial stress, all the uncertainty about the future seemed worth it. They chatted while the family enjoyed their impromptu snack. James learned they were from Atlanta, passing through on their way back from visiting relatives. When their luxury SUV's air conditioning had failed, they'd pulled over to wait for roadside assistance. We were supposed to be home hours ago, Catherine explained, but it seems like everything's gone wrong today. First, a detour because of road construction, then this breakdown. Sometimes detours lead to unexpected discoveries, James said, gesturing to the watermelon. If your AC hadn't failed, you might never have tried a Walker Sweet. Catherine smiled. A silver lining indeed. Have you been farming long, Mr. Walker? All my life, James replied. My grandfather started growing these watermelons after World War II. Spent decades perfecting them. It shows, Catherine said, taking another piece. There's something special about food grown with such care and tradition. You can taste the difference. James found himself telling her about the farm, about his grandfather's experiments with crossbreeding different varieties, about the careful seed selection process that continued to this day. Catherine listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions that revealed a surprising knowledge of agriculture. My grandfather was a farmer, she explained. Nothing as specialized as your operation, but I spent summers helping him tend his crops. There's something grounding about working the land, isn't there? There is, James agreed. Keeps you honest. Nature doesn't care about your excuses or your good intentions. Either you do the work right, or you don't get the results. They talked about the challenges facing small farmers, the drought that had plagued the region for 3 years, the difficulties of competing with large agricultural corporations. James was surprised by how easily the conversation flowed, how Catherine seemed to understand the issues without him having to explain the context. Alex and Emma, having devoured their portions, were now asking questions about how watermelons grew. James found himself explaining the life cycle of the plants, from planting to pollination to harvest, in terms the children could understand. You know, he said, if you put some of those seeds in pots with good soil, you might be able to grow your own watermelons. Emma's eyes widened. Really? Could we, Mom? Catherine laughed. I'm not sure our balcony garden is quite suited for watermelons, honey, but maybe we could visit a farm sometime and see how they're grown properly. You really don't need to give these away, Catherine insisted. Again as they finished. Your generosity is unnecessary. James waved her off. My daddy always said a kindness costs nothing but pays back tenfold in other ways. Besides, seeing those kids enjoy them is payment enough. A tow truck arrived shortly after, and as Catherine prepared to leave, she reached for her purse. Please, at least let me pay you for the watermelons. James stepped back, hands raised. Not necessary, ma'am. Just glad I could help make your wait a little more pleasant. Well, thank you, Mr. Walker, truly. She handed him a business card. If you're ever in Atlanta, please look me up. James pocketed the card without looking at it, assuming it was just a polite gesture. He waved as they drove away, then returned to his stand where Lily waited. Did they buy any melons, Daddy? She asked hopefully. Even better, he replied. We made some new friends. Lily rolled her eyes in the way only preteens can perfect. Friends don't pay the mortgage. The comment, so adult coming from his young daughter, struck James like a physical blow. She shouldn't have to worry about mortgages or bills. She should be thinking about bike rides and swimming holes and the simple pleasures of childhood. The weight of his failure as a provider settled heavier on his shoulders. By 6 o'clock, they had sold 3 more watermelons, bringing their day's total to $65. As they packed up, James tried to calculate how many more days like this it would take to make the mortgage payment. Too many, was the depressing answer. That evening, as Lily slept, James sat at the kitchen table surrounded by bills and bank statements. The numbers refused to add up to anything but disaster. In a month, maybe less, they would lose everything. He considered calling his brother in Ohio, who had offered him a job at his construction company. But the thought of leaving the farm, of admitting defeat, was almost unbearable. This land wasn't just property, it was his heritage, his daughter's birthright, the physical embodiment of his family's century of hard work. The kitchen walls seemed to close in around him as he stared at the column of red figures. The old farmhouse had witnessed generations of walkers facing adversity. His grandfather during the Dust Bowl, his father during the farm crisis of the 1980s. They had persevered, adapted, survived. Was he to be the one who finally lost it all? Outside, a summer storm had finally broken, rain pounding against the tin roof in a rhythm that had lulled James to sleep since childhood. Lightning illuminated the fields in brief, ghostly flashes, revealing the watermelon vines that represented his last hope. Too little, too late, he thought bitterly. The rain that might have saved his other crops months ago now served only as an ironic reminder of all he stood to lose. James reached into his pocket and pulled out Catherine Reynolds' business card, absent-mindedly turning it over in his fingers. For the first time, he actually read it. Asterisk, Catherine Reynolds. Asterisk, asterisk. Chief Executive Officer. Asterisk, asterisk. Reynolds Beverage Corporation asterisk. James froze, staring at the elegant logo embossed in silver. Same logo he'd seen countless times on bottles and cans in grocery stores across the country. Reynolds Beverage Corporation was one of the largest drink manufacturers in the world, producing everything from sodas to sports drinks to bottled water. No way, he whispered to the empty kitchen. The well-dressed woman and her children in the expensive SUV weren't just random travelers, they were part of one of the wealthiest families in America. And he had given them free watermelons. James chuckled at the absurdity of it. What were the chances? He tucked the card into his wallet, thinking it might make a good story someday. Remember what I gave free watermelons to the Reynolds family? Could have charged them $100 each, and they wouldn't have noticed. Oh! The rain continued through the night, a blessing for the thirsty fields, but a reminder of how precarious farming had become. Too little rain when you needed it, too much when you didn't. James lay awake, listening to the storm, turning over possibilities in his mind. Should he call his brother? Start planning their move to Ohio? Should he approach local restaurants again, offering special pricing to move more volume? Should he diversify? Try growing something besides watermelons? By dawn, he had no answers, only the familiar determination to face another day, to keep fighting until the very end. If the farm was going to fail, it wouldn't be because he'd given up too soon. The next day brought more of the same sweltering heat, sparse customers, and mounting anxiety. By the end of the week, James had made just enough to buy groceries and put gas in the truck, but nowhere near enough for the mortgage payment due Monday. Sunday night, he sat down with Lily to have the conversation he'd been dreading. "Sweetie, I need to talk to you about something important," he began, his heart breaking at her trusting gaze. "You know how things have been tough since Mom got sick?" Lily nodded solemnly. "Because of the hospital bills and the farm not making money." James swallowed hard. "That's right. And I've tried everything to keep us going, but—" He took a deep breath. "We might have to leave the farm, Lily. Uncle Rob has offered me a job in Ohio. We could stay with him until we get back on our feet." Lily's eyes filled with tears. "But this is our home. Mom is here." The simple statement cut through him like a knife. Sarah was buried beneath the old oak tree behind the farmhouse, where generations of walkers rested. The thought of leaving her behind felt like a betrayal. James pulled her into a hug, his own eyes stinging. "I know, baby, your mom will always be with us, wherever we go. But sometimes, we have to make hard choices. Can't we try one more week?" Lily pleaded. "Maybe we'll sell all our watermelons tomorrow." Unable to deny her that hope, James nodded. "One more week. We'll give it everything we've got." That night, He sat on the porch swing, listening to the symphony of crickets and frogs that had provided the soundtrack to his life. The moon cast long shadows across fields his grandfather had first plowed with mules. Every fence post, every tree, every building on the property was tied to a memory his father teaching him to drive the tractor. His mother's garden that bloomed with zinnias each summer, his first kiss with Sarah beneath the pecan tree by the pond. The thought of strangers living here, or worse, developers bulldozing it all for another cookie-cutter subdivision, was almost more than he could bear. But what choice did he have? A man's first responsibility was to his child, and Lily deserved stability, opportunities, a future brighter than he could provide here. Monday morning dawned clear and hot. James and Lily set up their stand earlier than usual, determined to make the most of their last week. The first few hours brought the typical trickle of customers: a local teacher, a couple of construction workers, an elderly couple who bought one melon out of pity. Around 11, James noticed a convoy of black vehicles approaching 3 sleek sedans, followed by a familiar SUV. His breath caught as they slowed and pulled onto the shoulder near his stand. "Daddy, are those the people from last week?" Lily whispered, clutching his hand. Before James could answer, car doors opened, and several men and women in business attire emerged. Catherine Reynolds stepped out of the SUV, now dressed in a tailored suit, looking every bit the CEO her business card proclaimed her to be. She smiled warmly as she approached. "Mr. Walker, I'm glad we found you again," she said, extending her hand. "I hope you don't mind us dropping by unannounced." James shook her hand, acutely aware of his worn jeans and faded t-shirt. "Not at all, Mrs. Reynolds. Nice to see you again. Is your air conditioning fixed?" She laughed. "It is, thank you. But that's not why we're here." She gestured to the people behind her. "This is part of my executive team. After I shared your watermelons with them back at headquarters, they insisted on trying them for themselves." A distinguished man in his 60s stepped forward. "James, I'm Richard Reynolds, Catherine's father and chairman of Reynolds Beverage Corporation. Those were the best watermelons any of us have ever tasted." James felt heat rising in his face. "Thank you, sir. It's my grandfather's special variety. Been in the family for generations." Catherine nodded to one of her colleagues, who opened a leather portfolio. "Mr. Walker, we'd like to discuss a business proposition with you. Is there somewhere we could talk?" James gestured to his modest setup, a folding table under a pop-up tent. "This is pretty much it, unless you'd like to come back to the farmhouse." "This is perfect," Catherine replied, pulling up one of his folding chairs. "We'll get right to the point. Reynolds Beverage Corporation is planning to launch a new line of natural fruit beverages next spring. We've been searching for distinctive flavor profiles that stand out from the competition." Richard continued. "When Catherine brought your watermelons to our test kitchen, our product development team was blown away. They've never encountered such perfect sweetness and flavor, especially without any added sugars or flavor enhancers." The younger man in stylish glasses opened a tablet. "We ran a complete analysis. Your watermelons have a unique sugar-acid balance and aromatic profile we haven't seen in any commercial varieties. May I ask, is this a proprietary hybrid?" "Why?" James nodded slowly, still trying to process what was happening. "Yes, my grandfather developed it in the 1950s. He crossbred several heirloom varieties, selected for sweetness and texture over many generations. We've kept our own seeds, never sold them commercially." Catherine leaned forward, her expression serious. "Mr. Walker, we'd like to partner with you. We want to launch a premium watermelon beverage using exclusively your Walker Sweet watermelons, with your family name and story as part of the branding." James stared at her, certain he had misheard. "You want to buy my watermelons?" "Not just buy them," Richard clarified. "We want to establish a long-term exclusive supply agreement. We're prepared to invest in expanding your production capacity, modernizing your irrigation systems, and providing technical support to increase your yield while maintaining quality." The woman with the portfolio handed James a document. "This is our initial proposal. We're offering a 5-year contract with guaranteed minimum purchase volumes, premium pricing well above market rates, and most importantly, a royalty on every bottle sold with brass. The Walker name. James scanned the figures on the page, his hands trembling slightly. The numbers seemed impossible enough to pay off his debt several times over, with plenty left to reinvest in the farm. "I don't understand," he admitted. "Why me? Why not go with one of the big commercial growers?" Catherine smiled. "Because they don't have what you have. A unique product with a genuine story behind it. Consumers today want authenticity. They want to know where their food comes from, the people who grow it, the tradition behind it. Your watermelons aren't just delicious, Mr. Walker. They're special. And in today's market, special is invaluable." End quote. "Plus," added Richard with a wink, "my grandchildren haven't stopped talking about your watermelons since they tasted them. Emma asked if we could buy the whole farm just to have them whenever she wants." For the first time in years, James felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Hope. But caution tempered his excitement. "This sounds incredible," he said carefully, "but I should probably have a lawyer look this over before I agree to anything." Catherine nodded approvingly. "Absolutely. We encourage that. In fact," she gestured to one of her colleagues, "we've taken the liberty of arranging for an independent agricultural contract attorney to review the agreement with you, at our expense, and with no obligation." Lily, who had been listening quietly, tugged on James's sleeve. "Daddy, does this mean we can keep the farm?" The simple question nearly broke him. He pulled her close. "I think it might, sweetheart. I think it just might." Richard crouched down to Lily's level. "You must be Lily. My grandchildren told me all about you. They said you know everything about growing watermelons." Lily straightened proudly. "I help my daddy every day. I can tell when they're perfectly ripe just by thumping them." "That's an important skill," Richard said seriously. "If we partner with your daddy, we might need your expert advice too." Over the next hour, as customers came and went buying more watermelons than usual, intrigued by the presence of the business executives, James discussed details with the Reynolds team. They explained their vision for Walker Sweet Watermelon Refresher, a premium beverage that would maintain the authentic flavor of his fruit through a specialized cold pressing process. "We don't want to change a thing about your watermelons," the product developer explained. "Our goal is to capture exactly what makes them special and share it with consumers across the country." James listened intently, asking careful questions about everything from production volumes to quality control. The farm had been his life's work, his family's legacy. If he was going to stake its future on this partnership, he needed to be certain it was the right decision. "What happens if demand exceeds supply?" he asked. "My current operation can only produce so many watermelons." Catherine had clearly anticipated this concern. "That's where our investment comes in. We want to help you scale up sustainably. Our agricultural team will work with you to increase yield without compromising quality. We understand that maintaining the unique characteristics of your watermelons is paramount." Another executive, a woman with a no-nonsense demeanor and sharp eyes, addressed the financial aspects. "Mr. Walker, we've done preliminary projections based on consumer trends and test marketing. We believe Walker Sweet has the potential to become one of our flagship products, particularly with younger consumers who are demanding more natural, authentic alternatives to artificial beverages." End quote. She showed him a chart on her tablet, illustrating projected sales growth over 5 years. "Based on even our most conservative estimates, the royalties alone should provide significant income. And that's before factoring in the premium pricing for your crops." James tried to maintain a poker face, but internally, his mind was reeling. The figure she was presenting would not only save the farm, but transform it into a thriving business again. He could pay off the bank, modernize his equipment, maybe even buy back some of the land his family had been forced to sell. "What about control?" he asked, voicing his deepest concern. "I need to maintain our growing methods, our seed selection process. That's what makes Walker Sweets what they are." Catherine nodded. "That's exactly what we want. Your expertise, your family's traditions, those are the assets we're investing in. We're not looking to change your watermelons. We're looking to bring them to a wider audience. You would maintain complete autonomy over your agricultural practices." By early afternoon, James had scheduled a meeting with the attorney for the following day. As the Reynolds team prepared to leave, Catherine pulled him aside. "There's something else you should know," she said quietly. "The kindness you showed us last week refusing payment, going out of your way to help strangers that matters to our family. Reynolds Beverage has always been about more than just profit. My grandfather started this company selling homemade lemonade during the Depression. He never forgot the people who helped him along the way." She handed him an envelope. "This is a good faith deposit to secure our intent to partner with you, regardless of the final contract details. I thought you might need it sooner rather than later." Inside was a certified check for $10,000. James stared at it, speechless. "No strings attached," Catherine assured him. "Consider it an advance on future business." After they left, James stood motionless by his stand, the check still in his hand, Lily dancing excitedly around him. "Are we rich now, Daddy?" she asked, her eyes shining. James laughed, lifting her into a hug and spinning her around. "Not rich, sweetheart, but I think we're going to be okay." That evening, instead of poring over past due notices, James spread the Reynolds proposal across the kitchen table. The terms were more generous than he could have imagined. Not just fair prices for his produce, but investment in infrastructure, technical support for expanding production, and royalties that could transform the farm's finances entirely. Most importantly, the agreement specified that James would maintain complete control over his growing methods and seed stock. The Reynolds Corporation wasn't trying to take over his operation or steal his grandfather's carefully developed variety. They valued it exactly as it was. As James reviewed the documents, his mind kept returning to the improbable sequence of events that had led to this moment. If the Reynolds SUV hadn't broken down, if he hadn't offered them watermelons, if Catherine hadn't shared them with her team, any break in that chain of coincidences would have left him facing foreclosure instead of this, quote, remarkable opportunity. He thought about his father's words, spoken years ago when James had complained about a particularly difficult season. "Farming isn't just about what you grow, son. It's about who you are while you're growing it. Do right by the land, do right by people, and somehow, it all works out." At the time, he dismissed it as his father's incurable optimism. Now, he wasn't so sure. In the corner of the kitchen, on a shelf above the sink, sat a framed photograph of his grandfather, standing proudly beside his first successful crop of what would become Walker sweet watermelons. The old man's weathered face beamed with pride, his hand resting protectively on a particularly fine specimen. Next to it was a picture of James's father with young James, showing him how to pollinate watermelon blossoms by hand. And beside that, a photo of Sarah, pregnant with Lily, sitting on the porch swing, a slice of watermelon in her hand, laughing at something beyond the camera's view. They had all believed in this land, in these watermelons. They had all made sacrifices to preserve something they deemed worthy. Perhaps, James thought, this unexpected turn of events wasn't just luck or coincidence. Perhaps it was the culmination of generations of faith and hard work, the universe finally balancing the scales. Or perhaps it was simply what happened when good people, both the Walkers with their commitment to quality and the Reynolds with their appreciation for authenticity, recognized value in each other's work. The next day, James met with Patricia Harrington, the agricultural attorney arranged by Reynolds. To his relief, she confirmed what seemed too good to be true. "This is an exceptionally favorable agreement, Mr. Walker," she said, after reviewing the documents. "I've worked with many farmers on corporate contracts, and I've never seen terms this generous. They're not just buying your watermelons, they're investing in you as a partner." Patricia, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s with a practical demeanor that immediately put James at ease, had spent 20 years representing farmers in negotiations with corporations. Her expertise was evident as she walked James through every clause of the contract, explaining implications and highlighting potential concerns. "What I find most impressive," she noted, tapping a section of the document, "is this commitment to maintaining your traditional growing methods. Most corporate partners would be pushing for increased yields at the expense of quality. Reynolds seems to understand that the value of your product lies precisely in these artisanal practices." End quote. James nodded. That was my biggest worry, that they'd want to commercialize everything, turn it into just another mass-produced crop. Based on this agreement, that's not their intention at all, Patricia assured him. There are multiple safeguards here ensuring your autonomy over agricultural decisions. She suggested a few minor adjustments, clarifying language around quality standards, strengthening James' rights to his proprietary seed stock, adjusting the royalty structure to ensure fair compensation, regardless of how the product line expanded. With these changes, she said, closing her folder, I would have no hesitation recommending you sign this agreement. It represents a remarkable opportunity for both parties. With Patricia's guidance, James negotiated the adjustments to the contract, which the Reynolds team readily accepted. By the end of the week, he had signed the agreement and deposited the initial payment enough to cover his overdue mortgage and keep the bank at bay. James expected a sense of euphoria, but what he felt instead was something deeper and more substantial. A bone-deep relief mingled with cautious optimism. For the first time in years, he could look to the future with hope rather than dread. The following Monday, he walked into Harold Phillips' office at the bank, a cashier's check for the full amount of his overdue payments in hand. Harold's eyebrows shot up as he examined the check. Well now, this is unexpected. Come into some money, have you? You could say that, James replied, unable to suppress a smile. I've entered into a partnership with Reynolds Beverage Corporation. They're launching a new product line using my watermelons. Harold's expression shifted from surprise to disbelief. Reynolds? The national company? The very same. James handed over the contract as proof. They're investing in expanding my operation. Turns out my grandfather's watermelon variety is worth something after all. As Harold skimmed the document, his professional demeanor slipped, revealing genuine amazement. James, this is remarkable. Congratulations. Thank you, James said, feeling a surge of satisfaction at the banker's reaction. I'll be making regular payments from now on, and I'd like to discuss options for improving the property. I'll need a new irrigation system, equipment upgrades, maybe additional acreage if any comes available. Harold nodded eagerly, clearly reassessing James's status from risky investment to valuable client. Of course. We'd be happy to discuss financing options for improvements. Let me get some materials together for you. Walking out of the bank, James felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The burden of debt that had pressed down on him for so long was beginning to ease. The farm wasn't just going to survive, it was going to thrive. The transformation began almost immediately. Within days, a team of agricultural consultants arrived to assess the farm and develop an enhancement plan. Modern irrigation systems replaced his aging equipment. Soil scientists analyzed his fields and recommended sustainable improvements that would increase yield while maintaining the unique characteristics of his watermelons. A group of engineers from Reynolds' Product Development Division spent a week at the farm, studying every aspect of the growing process. They took soil samples, measured sugar content at different stages of ripeness, analyzed water quality, and observed James' cultivation techniques. We need to understand exactly what makes Walker Sweets so special, explained Maya Chen, the lead food scientist. That way, we can ensure our processing methods preserve those qualities in the final product. Maya became a regular presence at the farm over the following months, her genuine enthusiasm for the project endearing her to both James and Lily. Unlike some of the other corporate representatives, who maintained a professional distance, Maya dove into farm life with gusto, not hesitating to get her hands dirty as she learned about watermelon cultivation. In my 20 years developing beverages, she told James one evening as they sampled different ripeness stages, I've never worked with a raw ingredient this perfect. Most of our job is compensating for deficiencies, adding sweeteners, flavor enhancers, balancing acidity. With your watermelons, our challenge is simply not to die. Mess them up. Through it all, James insisted on maintaining the traditional growing methods his grandfather had established. The secret isn't just in the seeds, he explained to the Reynolds team. It's how we care for them, the timing of the harvest, everything working together. Catherine and her team respected his expertise, incorporating his knowledge into their plans rather than imposing their own methods. By the following spring, Walker Farms had expanded to its original 200 acres, with carefully managed fields producing watermelons that maintained their distinctive quality despite the increased volume. The development team at Reynolds worked closely with James to perfect their process for capturing the essence of Walker's sweet watermelons in beverage form. They experimented with different extraction methods, preservation techniques, and formulations, always with James as the final judge of authenticity. "It has to taste like you're biting into one of my watermelons on a hot summer day," he insisted during one tasting session. "Nothing artificial, nothing added, just pure watermelon goodness." Maya nodded appreciatively. "That's exactly what makes this product special, James. We're not creating a watermelon-flavored drink, we're bottling the experience of your watermelons." Marketing teams conducted focus groups and consumer testing, finding that the authentic story behind the product resonated strongly with potential customers. They developed packaging that featured an illustration of Walker Farms, complete with the distinctive red barn and rolling fields. James and Lily's story became central to the brand identity. The struggling farmer preserving his family legacy, the generational knowledge passed down, the chance encounter that brought it all to a wider audience. "We're not just selling a beverage," Catherine explained during a strategy meeting. "We're selling a connection to something real, something with history and heart. In a market saturated with artificial products, that authenticity is our strongest asset." The marketing team wanted to film a commercial at the farm, featuring James and Lily in their daily routines. James initially hesitated, uncomfortable with the spotlight, but Lily's excitement convinced him. The resulting advertisement showing father and daughter tending vines, selecting perfect specimens, sharing watermelon slices in the golden afternoon light, captured the essence of Walker Farms with surprising sensitivity. "That's actually pretty good," James admitted after viewing the final cut. "You didn't make it all slick and fake." The director, a young woman with an artistic sensibility, smiled. "We didn't need to. The real story is compelling enough." As the launch date approached, Catherine invited James and Lily to Reynolds headquarters in Atlanta for a final tasting of the production samples. The gleaming corporate offices were a world away from their farmhouse, but the Reynolds family made them feel welcome, treating them as valued partners rather than suppliers. Richard Reynolds personally conducted the tour, showing them the state-of-the-art facilities where Walker Sweet Watermelon Refresher would be produced. "We've developed a proprietary cold pressing method specifically for your watermelons," he explained. "It preserves the flavor profile better than conventional processing." In the test kitchen, Maya presented the final product formulation. No added sweeteners, no artificial flavors, no preservatives beyond what's absolutely necessary for shelf stability, just pure Walker Sweet watermelon, captured at the peak of ripeness. James took a cautious sip from the sample bottle, then a longer drink. The flavor was remarkably true to his watermelons, the perfect balance of sweetness and refreshment, the distinctive aromatic notes that set Walker Sweets apart from commercial varieties. He nodded slowly, emotion tightening his throat. "My grandfather would be proud," he said simply. The product launch of Walker Sweet Watermelon Refresher exceeded everyone's expectations. The marketing campaign featured James and Lily on their farm, telling the story of 3 generations of watermelon cultivation and the chance encounter that had brought the Walker and Reynolds families together. Social media influencers embraced the authentic narrative, sharing their reactions to tasting the beverage for the first time. #WalkerSweet began trending as consumers posted photos of themselves with the distinctive bottles, often comparing the experience to childhood memories of eating watermelon on hot summer days. Retailers reported strong initial sales, with many locations struggling to keep the product in stock. Health-conscious consumers appreciated the simple ingredient list, while those seeking authentic experiences were drawn to the story behind the beverage. Critics in the food and beverage industry took notice as well. Walker Sweet Watermelon Refresher represents a potential paradigm shift in the beverage industry, wrote one influential reviewer. By prioritizing quality and authenticity over mass production and artificial enhancement, Reynolds has created something that transcends the category of fruit drink and becomes an experience in itself. Consumers responded enthusiastically to both the product and the story behind it. Sales surpassed projections, and within 6 months, Reynolds Beverage Corporation was expanding distribution nationally. The royalty checks began arriving monthly, growing larger with each passing quarter. For James, the financial transformation was just one aspect of the partnership's impact. Equally significant was the validation of his family's legacy, the recognition that the Walker Sweet watermelon, carefully developed and preserved through generations, had genuine value in a world increasingly dominated by mass production and artificial substitutes. Lily, too, was transformed by the experience. Her interest in the farm, once primarily a desire to help her father, evolved into genuine passion. She began keeping detailed notes on the watermelon varieties she was experimenting with in her small garden plot, showing a scientific precision that impressed even Maya. "Your daughter has a remarkable palate," Maya told James after Lily had correctly identified subtle flavor differences in test samples that even trained tasters had missed. "And she understands the relationship between cultivation practices and flavor outcomes. That's rare, even among professional food scientists." James watched with pride as Lily flourished, her natural intelligence finding purpose in continuing the family tradition. She began accompanying him to agricultural conferences, asking insightful questions that sometimes stumped even experienced farmers. Several universities with strong agricultural programs had already expressed interest in her, despite her young age, offering to develop specialized educational pathways. 1 year after their initial meeting, Catherine Reynolds returned to the farm, this time for a celebration. Walker Farms had been transformed. The weathered farmhouse had been renovated, the equipment modernized, and 50 new employees from the surrounding community now worked the expanded operation. "I brought someone who wanted to see what became of those free watermelons," Catherine said, as Emma and Alex bounded from the car, racing toward Lily, who waited on the porch. James welcomed them with genuine warmth. "I can never thank you enough for what you've done for us." Catherine shook her head. "We should be thanking you. Walker Sweet has become our fastest-growing product line. The authenticity of your story resonates with consumers in a way our marketing team couldn't have manufactured if they tried." Richard joined them on the porch, surveying the thriving operation with satisfaction. "You know, James, when Catherine first brought those watermelons to our test kitchen, I thought she was exaggerating their quality. 30 years in this business. You get skeptical about revolutionary new products. But she was right. Your watermelons are something special." As they walked through the flourishing fields, James reflected on the remarkable turn his life had taken. The farm that had been on the brink of foreclosure was now thriving. The debts that had seemed insurmountable had been paid in full. Lily was thriving too, proudly showing Alex and Emma the new greenhouse where they experimented with watermelon varieties. "We're expanding the Walker Sweet line next season," Catherine mentioned as they watched the children. "If you're agreeable, we'd like to introduce variations: watermelon berry blends, watermelon citrus. Our product team is eager to work with you on development." James nodded, his mind already considering the possibilities. "I've been experimenting with some crossbreeding myself. There's a black diamond variety that, when crossed with our Walker Sweet, produces an interesting flavor profile, a little more complexity, hints of honey notes." "That sounds promising," Catherine replied. "Your instincts for flavor have been spot on so far." They discussed future plans, potential expansion into international markets, development of related product lines, educational programs that would bring school children to the farm to learn about sustainable agriculture. The partnership had evolved beyond a simple supply agreement into a collaborative relationship built on mutual respect and shared values. As the sun began to set, they gathered on the farmhouse porch for dinner, the Walker and Reynolds families together, sharing a meal and watching the children play on the lawn. Richard raised his glass of Walker Sweet watermelon refresher in a toast. "To unexpected encounters and kindness freely given," he said. "And to the sweetest watermelons in the world." James raised his own glass, thinking of his grandfather who had developed the special variety, and his father who had preserved it, and Sarah who had loved this farm as much as he did. "To family legacies," he added. "Past, present, and future." Later that evening, after their guests had departed and Lily was asleep, James stood on the porch looking out over his fields, now bathed in moonlight. The weight that had pressed down on him for so long, The fear of failure, the burden of debt, the uncertainty of the future had lifted. In its place was a sense of security he hadn't felt in years. The partnership with Reynolds Beverage Corporation hadn't just saved his farm, it had honored his family's legacy and opened new possibilities he never could have imagined. All because he'd offered watermelons to a family in need, expecting nothing in return. James thought about the encounters that shape lives, the moments that seem insignificant until viewed in retrospect. He thought about kindness, freely given, without expectation of reward. He thought about the generations of walkers who had tended this land, and the generations to come who would continue the tradition. And he thought about watermelons, the humble fruit that had carried his family's hopes and dreams through decades of challenges and triumphs. The sweetness, hidden beneath the rind, waiting to be discovered by those who knew how to look for it. In the distance, he could see the outline of the new visitor center being constructed near the highway, where tourists would soon be able to learn about Walker watermelons and the partnership that had transformed a struggling farm into a thriving enterprise. Next year, they would host school groups, teaching children about sustainable agriculture and the importance of preserving heirloom varieties. James smiled, remembering Catherine's words during their first meeting. "Your watermelons aren't just delicious, Mr. Walker, they're special." He hadn't fully understood then what she meant, but now he did. What made his watermelons special wasn't just their sweetness or their perfect texture. It was the story they told, the tradition they represented, the authenticity they embodied. In a world increasingly dominated by mass production and artificial flavors, Walker's sweet watermelons offered something genuine, a taste cultivated through generations of careful stewardship, a connection to the land and the people who tended it. As James turned to go inside, he noticed Lily's small garden plot at the edge of the yard, her own experimental patch where she was growing watermelons from seeds she had carefully selected herself. At 10 years old, she was already showing the same intuitive understanding of plants that had guided his grandfather. The legacy would continue. The following morning, James drove to town for his monthly meeting with Harold Phillips, the bank manager who had once threatened foreclosure on his farm. Their relationship had changed dramatically over the past year. "James, good to see you," Harold greeted him warmly, ushering him into his office. "I saw the new billboard on Highway 82. Walker Sweet Watermelon Refresher, Nature's Perfect Sweetness. Impressive marketing." James smiled. "Catherine Reynolds has a talented team. They've been careful to keep the messaging authentic to what we believe in." Harold shook his head in amazement. "If someone had told me a year ago that Walker Farms would become the cornerstone of a national beverage campaign, I wouldn't have believed it. You've become quite the local success story." "Just lucky, I guess," James replied modestly. "Luck might have played a part," Harold acknowledged, "but you've worked hard for this. Your father and grandfather would be proud." After reviewing his accounts now healthily in the black, James drove to the cemetery on the outskirts of town. He placed a fresh-cut watermelon on Sarah's grave, something he did every week during growing season. "You wouldn't believe it, Sarah," he said quietly, sitting beside the headstone. "Remember how you always said my grandfather's watermelons were too good to stay a secret? Well, they're not a secret anymore." He told her about the expansion plans, about Lily's growing interest in plant breeding, about the scholarship fund they'd established in Sarah's name for local students interested in agricultural science. "I wish you were here to see it all," he concluded, his voice thick with emotion. "But I think maybe you are, in a way. You're part of everything good that happens to us." When James returned to the farm, he found an unexpected visitor waiting. Daniel Foster, his nearest neighbor and owner of Foster Farms, a much larger operation that specialized in corn and soybeans. Daniel had been struggling with the same economic pressures that had nearly ruined James, but without the miraculous intervention of a chance encounter. "Heard you might be hiring seasonal workers for the harvest," Daniel said, after declining James's offer of iced tea. "Thought I'd check if the rumors were true." James nodded. "We're expanding again, planning to double production next year if we can maintain quality." Daniel looked around at the obvious improvements to the property, the new equipment shed, the renovated barn, the visitor center under construction. "Quite a turnaround," he observed, his tone carefully neutral. "Some folks are wondering how you managed it." James understood the implied question. In small farming communities, sudden prosperity often raised eyebrows and sparked speculation. It's no secret, Daniel. I've partnered with Reynolds Beverage Corporation. They're using my watermelons for a new drink line. Daniel's eyebrows rose. Reynolds? The big national company? The same. They happened to try my watermelons and liked what they tasted. Sometimes life takes unexpected turns. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Well, good for you. Not all of us get that lucky break. James could hear the bitterness in his neighbor's voice. It wasn't just luck, he said gently. My grandfather spent decades developing this watermelon variety. My father preserved it when everyone else was switching to commercial hybrids. I stuck with it even when it seemed foolish. Sometimes what looks like an overnight success is really generations in the making. End quote. After Daniel left, James found Lily in the experimental greenhouse, carefully pollinating watermelon blossoms by hand, just as he had taught her. Mr. Foster looked sad, she observed, not looking up from her work. James sat on a bench beside her. He's having a hard time with his farm. Not everyone has been as fortunate as we have. Lily considered this. Could we help him? The question gave James pause. He had been so focused on saving his own farm, on securing his family's future, that he hadn't thought much about his struggling neighbors. But Lily's simple question triggered a memory of his father's words. A farmer who prospers alone isn't really prospering at all. The land connects us all. That evening, James called Catherine Reynolds with an idea, a cooperative program that would allow local farmers to diversify a portion of their land to grow Walker Sweet watermelons under contract, with technical support from both Walker Farms and Reynolds Beverage Corporation. The program would provide a stable income stream for participating farms, while helping Reynolds meet the growing demand for their product. It's not charity, James explained. These are good farmers who know this land better than anyone. With some guidance on our specific growing methods, they could produce quality fruit that meets our standards. Everyone benefits. They get financial stability, you get increased supply without sacrificing quality, and we strengthen the whole community. Catherine was intrigued. A sort of franchised growing operation, but maintaining central quality control through your expertise. It's an interesting model. Let me discuss it with the team. Within weeks, the Walker Sweet Growers Cooperative was taking shape. 5 local farms, including Foster's, joined the initial program. James personally oversaw the training, sharing the specialized knowledge that had been passed down through generations of his family. The cooperative model proved remarkably effective. Each participating farm dedicated a portion of their acreage to Walker Sweet watermelons, receiving seeds, technical support, and guaranteed purchase contracts. James insisted on maintaining rigorous quality standards, conducting regular inspections to ensure that every watermelon bearing the Walker name met the established criteria. For farmers like Daniel Foster, the program offered a lifeline, a stable income stream that helped offset the volatility of commodity crop prices. For Reynolds Beverage Corporation, it provided increased production capacity without compromising quality. And for the community, it created a new economic engine, generating jobs and preserving agricultural land that might otherwise have been sold to developers. You've created something remarkable here, Catherine told James during a visit to inspect the cooperative's first harvest. This model could be replicated in other regions, with other specialty crops. It's a way for small farmers to compete in a market increasingly dominated by corporate agriculture. As summer turned to fall, the Walker Sweet Watermelon Refresher continued to gain market share. New variations were introduced. A watermelon lime blend that became an instant hit, a watermelon ginger version that appealed to health-conscious consumers. Each bottle proudly displayed the Walker Farms logo alongside the Reynolds Beverage Corporation emblem, a visual representation of the partnership that had transformed both businesses. During harvest season, visitors began arriving at the farm, curious consumers who wanted to see where their favorite beverage originated. The visitor center, now completed, offered tours and tastings, educating people about sustainable agriculture and the importance of preserving heirloom varieties. Lily, now 11, had become something of a celebrity among these visitors. Her natural charm and deep knowledge of watermelon cultivation made her the perfect ambassador for the family business. She particularly enjoyed leading school groups, explaining to children her own age how plants grew and why biodiversity mattered. "My grandpa always said every watermelon tells a story," she would tell them, echoing words James had shared with her. "You just have to know how to listen." 1 year became 2, then 3. The partnership with Reynolds Beverage Corporation flourished, expanding to include new products and markets. The Walker Sweet Growers Cooperative grew to include 15 farms, creating a network of sustainable agriculture that revitalized the entire region. James, who had once faced financial ruin, now found himself in a position to give back to his community. He established agricultural scholarships, funded improvements to local schools, and created a foundation focused on sustainable farming practices. The success of Walker Farms had ripple effects that extended far beyond his own fields. Through it all, he maintained the core values that had guided his family for generations: respect for the land, commitment to quality, and generosity toward others. The watermelons that had saved his farm were more than just a crop. They were the physical embodiment of those values, the sweet fruit of 3 generations of careful stewardship. On the 5th anniversary of their partnership, Reynolds Beverage Corporation hosted a celebration at their headquarters in Atlanta. James and Lily, now 13 and considering a future in agricultural science, were guests of honor. The event showcased the remarkable success of the Walker Sweet product line, which had grown to include dozen variations and was now available in markets worldwide. Catherine Reynolds, addressing the gathered executives and media representatives, told the story that had become part of company lore, how a chance encounter on a hot summer day had led to one of the most successful product launches in the company's history. "When my children and I tasted those watermelons by the side of the road," she concluded, "we weren't just experiencing a delicious fruit. We were discovering a legacy of care, commitment, and craft that spans generations." What James Walker offered us that day wasn't just watermelons. It was a reminder that the best things in life often come from the most unexpected sources. As applause filled the room, James reflected on the journey that had brought him here. From the brink of losing everything to becoming a valued partner in a global enterprise, his path had been neither straight nor predictable. But through all the twists and turns, one constant remained: the watermelons his grandfather had cultivated with such care, the sweet legacy that had sustained his family through generations of challenge and change. And as he looked at Lily, confidently answering questions from curious executives about her latest experiments in watermelon breeding, James knew that legacy would continue, evolving with each generation while remaining true to its essential nature, like the perfect watermelon, sweet at its core, nourishing those who recognized its value. The struggling farmer who had once given free watermelons to strangers had found not just financial security, but something far more valuable: the opportunity to honor his family's past while securing its future, to share the fruits of his labor with the world, and to transform an act of simple kindness into a harvest of unexpected blessings. And it had all begun with those watermelons, freely given on a hot summer day, to a family he never expected to see again. Life, James reflected, was a lot like farming. You planted seeds without knowing exactly what would grow, nurtured them with faith and persistence, and sometimes, if you were fortunate, harvested rewards beyond your wildest expectations.